So since I recently just did every ABC Saturday morning show ever, I usually pick a pilot or something based on one of those shows to talk about. And as I was researching ABC and their Saturday morning lineup, I came across something sort of interesting. That is an episode of what was essentially Super Friends. Super Friends gets retitled and rechanged a lot of times. But what was basically the final season of Super Friends, which is actually called the Superpowers Team, the Galactic Guardians, they actually made an episode that was sort of a backdoor pilot for a Batman show that never got made, which would have been in the mid-80s, well before Batman the Animated Series. So in 1985, this aired actually on September 28th, 1985, they decided to make a script that they tried to make a Batman spin-off. Apparently that didn't take. They still had the script and they decided to make what would have been sort of a Batman origin story in the Super Friends. Batman at the time was voiced by Adam West. Robin was voiced by Casey Kasem. They were originally planning to do this as a spin-off. It never really took off, and they just sort of made the episode because I guess they spent money on the script or something. This is the first time we ever, in any media, in terms of movies, TV shows, had ever seen Batman's origin story, the idea of Crime Alley, seeing his parents murdered before him. Now, I know that's become a cliche at this point, and it's sort of interesting because I thought the 1989 Batman was the first one. I assumed they didn't do that on the Adam West Batman from the 60s, but I always thought it was 1989's Batman. It wasn't. It was actually this episode of Super Friends. Now, they don't actually show Joe Chill or Joe Cool or whatever killing Batman's parents. They kind of strongly insinuate it, and it gets rather dark, actually. You see Bruce Wayne, how it affected him, and all these things. Now, the other interesting thing about this has echoes of what would later happen with Batman Begins, because the villain in this episode is the Scarecrow. Now, the Scarecrow is actually different. He doesn't have gas in this. He has horror transmitters, I guess. Basically like jack-o'-lantern things, and he transmits a fear signal, and it makes people afraid of things. And what's interesting is he's chasing Batman, and Batman just walks into Crime Alley, and the Scarecrow's like, wait, I didn't even press that thing. What the fuck's going on, man? And Batman basically, freaks out because he's never been in Crime Alley before since what happened, and actually starts crying. It gets, it's very different from Super Friends. Now, this isn't technically Super Friends. It was rebranded because of the Superpowers action figures. Actually, it's the only one to not be labeled Super Friends, because if you notice when I do this every show ever, I keep mentioning different names. They kept canceling it, bringing it back, rebranding it. The Super Friends series run is highly confusing. Like, reading the Wikipedia, I was like, why'd you do it? It was actually canceled 3 times. The last episode's a Death of Superman, pre-Death of Superman. This show's crazy. But, yeah, he actually has this breakdown in the rain. You see him crying, which is like, you already have the rain metaphor for crying, and you have him crying. Whatever, Super Friends. Yeah, it is interesting, and it's interesting to see how they would have done a Batman show this is pre, like, most people knew Year One or Dark Knight Rises and all that stuff. This is pre all that. So the idea of them doing a Batman show in the mid-80s, right before you have Tim Burton's Batman, is really interesting, because that is a previous version of Batman, and it kind of shows you what they could have done, which they didn't, but it kind of, voiced by Adam West with Robin as Casey Kasem is weird, because you would have thought they'd do Burt Ward. Was Burt Ward busy, or they just, I don't know, but it's odd hearing Adam West explain the origin of Batman, even though it's like he's played Batman. It's so confusing, like, it just, feels off. It doesn't feel like his Batman, and he was actually good at it. I think if this had happened, maybe our perception of Batman would be different. Maybe they would have done the series different. It seems like they already knew, something was going on with Batman, so they should have a show. The shots aren't as good as the animated series, so, you'll see, they're and that's how he became Batman. It's just, him not framed very well. It really looks like such a rush job on these things. But it is interesting to see that they did want to do something a little darker, as much as Super Friends and those shows would allow. As I was a comics fan before, comics exploded and, things were accurate, you kind of got used to them messing up superheroes' powers and things like that. And especially in terms of Scarecrow, that doesn't feel highly inappropriate. They also have Wonder Woman is along the ride for most of the story, but it's mainly about Batman conquering his fear of the death of his parents and fighting the Scarecrow. I'm wondering, watching this, has Warner Brothers always had this idea, did they present this to Christopher Nolan? They're like, we like the Scarecrow with Batman's origin, Did Christopher Nolan watch this episode? Was he a big Galactic Guardians fan? I don't know. But the interesting thing of this, and I think as well as, oh, by the way, they refer to Batman as the man with no fear, which is ridiculous. That I was like, oh my god, guys, he's not Daredevil. How could... Because at one point they shoot him and they make Robin afraid of heights. That's strange. But, so the interesting thing about this is, first off, it is the first time we ever saw the origin story of Bruce Wayne and Batman, like ever in any media. This is the first time it's presented to anyone. If you've never read the comics, and I guess we're watching the show, you would have been surprised by that. The Scarecrow Batman origin story thing, this is the first time that was presented together. I'm so curious, like, how that exactly happened. Like, it just seems like such a strange way, like that this was like brought in earlier, and even brings up trying to make his powers and like scare all of Gotham City at a certain point. Like, I'm really curious, like, the connection to Batman Begins, if there is one, because there clearly is, as well as like the idea of like them doing the spin-off, and like I'm really curious like what this show could have been. I don't think it would have been as good as Batman the Animated Series. It probably would have been replayed and reruns when 1989's Batman did, much like the Batman the 60s show did. There has been a rumor that there wasn't a Batman solo show until animated series. That is not true. I've heard them actually say that on stage at New York Comic Con and stuff. It's not true. There were previous versions. To my understanding, they weren't as good and clearly didn't do his origin story. But the idea of that this would have tried to be a little more authentic under the Super Friends guise sounds actually sort of interesting to me. So this seems like such an unique possibility that could have happened. And it was kind of an interesting watch. It's like watching a show think like maybe this is how we'll mature, and like watching that kind of vein of superhero shows thinking like this is the way we have to take it kind of shows me like a weird avenue of pop culture that probably could have happened in the mid-80s that didn't, that I'm highly fascinated to be like if there are any other ideas they ever developed. I couldn't find much about this potential other ideas for this Batman show, but it sounds like an interesting one of a mid-80s kind of more mature Super Friends thing, and having Batman, you know, fight Scarecrow in this way, and, you know, being more horror and fear based, and, you know, having, you know, him like confront the idea of his parents and like actually cry and become a little kid in some moments is just sort of terrifying compared to most Super Friends. So I would recommend this if you can see it. It's a little harder. I know it's on DC Universe. It is not on HBO Max. I had to purchase it on iTunes just because I was sort of fascinated by the idea of it. The episode's called The Fear. It's an episode of the Superpowers team, Galactic Guardians, and it is probably one of the more notable ones. It's always brought up, and if you hear about the later seasons, they always bring up this episode because it is sort of unique. It is sort of strange, and it makes you think of the possibilities of what a 1985-1986 Batman show pre-Tim Burton would have been like. Okay.